Good morning. We're reading Mark 16, 1 through 14. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone away for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. He said, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept, but when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After these things, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. The word of the Lord. You may be seated.
We'll dismiss our kids now to Children's Church.
Good morning, Lake Taps. Happy Easter. When you think of Easter, what are the memories that come to mind for you? What are the stories, the events that come to mind for you? For me, growing up as a child, the first thing that comes to mind is chocolate, Easter egg hunts, bright colors emerging in gardens, spring arriving, winter finally ending. Now, as I move along, as life progressed for me, I see some things that are more on a sober note. I remember actually during college, that Holy Week, my second year of college, my grandfather passed away. So I remember as a family, we all flew out to Eastern Canada for his funeral. So as life progresses, my memories of Easter, I'm sure for you as well, some of you at least, there have been some speed bumps when we think of Easter. We've endured some of us have endured some bumps, experienced some bruises. And so when we think of Easter, there's joy, there's lightheartedness, but also it's also tinged with some pain for some of us. Now, the message of Easter, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, speaks profoundly to those moments of hardship, of pain, of difficulty in our lives. And using terms of punctuation, the Easter story, the story of Jesus being raised from the dead, tells us that the pain in our lives, the difficulty, the hardship, those things are not actually periods, they are commas. The resurrection of Jesus tells us that actually this life is not all that there is. Death has been defeated. And that brings in a whole new world. You know, Leslie Newbigin, one of the famous missionaries of the 20th century, was once asked, "Hey, Leslie Newbigin, are you an optimist or a pessimist?" To which he replied, he came back like a shot and said, "Neither. Jesus Christ has risen from the dead." So optimism and pessimism have nothing to do with it in one sense, because the resurrection brings in a whole different category. You think of the world in which we live right now, the moment for many people when we think of the European continent, what's happening in Eastern Europe, the crisis, the turmoil, the fear, the uncertainty. Optimism or pessimism? Neither. Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead. It's a new category. The leading Bible scholar named N.T. Wright, he tells a story when he was a bishop in the Church of England, the Anglican Church. He tells a story of being in a long, like a whole day series of meetings discussing different theological issues, and he was just fatigued and flustered by it all, and he gets into a taxi cab at the end of it, and as if you've been in a taxi before, these guys are very good at engaging you in conversation, to the point of also being fatigued by that. But you get into the conversation, he gets into the conversation with the taxi cab driver, and he tells him some of the struggles, some of the fatigue he's experienced from these church meetings, and the taxi cab driver, a bit rough, looks back to him and says, look, if God raised Jesus from the dead, everything else is rock and roll. If you can imagine, this taxi cab driver has no idea. He's like, look, I get all these issues, but look, if God has raised Jesus Christ from the dead, everything else doesn't really matter, does it? Everything else is rock and roll. The whole of Christian faith, the business of Christianity orbits around Jesus Christ living, dying, and being raised to life. This is why Paul, who for some of us we may not be familiar with, Paul wrote many books that are in the New Testament, the second half of the Bible. And this is one letter he wrote, part of a letter he wrote to a church in ancient Greece saying, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. He's saying, look, we've banked our whole lives on this thing, and if it's not true, we are to be pitied. Putting it oppositely, he said, this thing is so worth it. It's so worth banking your whole life on it. Because if the thing is not true, then we're to be pitied. The story of Christ's resurrection changes how we view this life. It's a completely different world into which Christ makes possible through overcoming the power of death. It changes how we view this life, it changes how we view death, and it changes how we view life after death. Now, this morning, what I'd like to do in these next few moments is just zoom in on the passage we just heard read for us, particularly just the first 8 verses. So Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. And we'll want to look at the context. The context, as we know, it shapes the meaning of any passage of Scripture, really any genre you look at. If you miss the context, you've missed the meaning. But we're going to look at the context and then look at how this story, this particular story, because there are many stories in the Bible of Jesus being raised from the dead that tell the same story, but just in different ways. But we're going to look at this particular story of the resurrection and how it helps us discover, first of all, truth, God, how God sees us, how God sees you, and how we're to respond to him. I want to look at how this is going to help us discover truth, God, how God sees us, and how we are to respond to him. Let me pray. God, in these next few moments, we ask that you would speak to us. Help us to hear your voice, Lord. Thank you that you speak. You have spoken perhaps most profoundly through raising Jesus Christ from the dead. Help us to catch a glimpse again of that glorious, unimaginably amazing moment and internalize it in our lives today. In your name, amen. So we start with the context. The beginning of this story tells us that the end of Sabbath, when Sabbath was passed. Now, Sabbath, the end of Sabbath effectively means sunset on Saturday. So approximately 6 p.m. on Saturday, that's when Sabbath would close. And these women are going to get spices. Now, they could have gone, say, at the end of Sabbath, they could have gone when the shops reopened that evening, Saturday evening, or early Sunday morning. But either way, they go to get spices. Now, why are they going to get spices? We're told they're going to get spices to anoint Jesus' body. It's part of the burial process. The spices were intended to cover the stench from the body's decay, after which the bones would be put into an ossuary, like a type of bone box. Now, in the story, if we're reading carefully, note what is being said and what is not being said. The women come to help with the burial. That's their plan. They're coming with spices, particularly to anoint a dead body. That's what they're going for. What they are not going to do, what they're not expecting, is to see Jesus raised from the dead. There's no expectation. There's no framework within which Jesus is alive. Because for these women, particularly, we actually read on Good Friday, we've read that in chapter 15 of Mark, these same women actually have seen Jesus tortured. They've seen him killed. They've seen him brutalized. They've seen the place where he was buried. They've seen the whole thing. So they know, just like we do, that actually when dead people die, that's it. There's finality. This is why in verse 3 we see they ask, when they're on their way, they're asking, who's going to roll the stone away? Because they're fully expecting to see a dead body. The question for them is not, what will they do when they see a resurrected Jesus? The question is, who's going to move away the stone so we can actually help with the burial process? And that's when they see the tomb and realize that someone has already moved the stone back. And if you can get yourself somehow into that moment, they're not filled with joy or glee. It's probably actually a very eerie feeling. Hold on, something's wrong here. They enter the tomb, and by all descriptions, they see an angel. And common to everyone else in Scripture, both Old Testament and New Testament, when someone encounters an angel, they're not filled with joy, they're filled with terror. That's why whenever I have many friends who've said, look, if God just brought an angel down, okay, that's what I believe. And I look at them and say, no, you wouldn't believe, you'd be scared out of your wits. That wouldn't make you believe, that might actually make you go even further back. Because in the Scriptures, people are terrified, and this is exactly what happens. When they see this angel, they're afraid, they're alarmed. That's why the angel actually says, do not be alarmed. You were looking, and then he goes into fine detail. The word-by-word play is very interesting here. He says, you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Check. That's who they're looking for. Who was crucified. Check. He has risen. Whoa, hold on. Risen? And actually in the Greek, to get slightly technical here, it's actually even more weighty. It's actually, he was raised. In other words, this is God's business. This is a God thing. God has actually raised him from the dead. And you can see slowly their heartbeat probably goes up a tick at that point. And then the angel says, he's not here. And then he actually, it's a very Christ thing, what he does there. He actually says, take a look. It's not actually just close your eyes and just believe. It's actually take a look at the place. Look at this place where they laid him. See. And then he gives instructions. He says, go and tell the disciples, go and tell the friends of Jesus and Peter that that's Jesus, is going before you to Galilee. Then he continues his instructions to these women. He says, then you will see him just as he told you. I'll just stop there for a moment. As we've looked through, the last few months, we've been looking at the Gospel of Mark. Now, for those who are not familiar with the Gospel of Mark, it's one of 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament. It's telling us the life, teachings, death, resurrection of Jesus. Mark is just one account. But in Mark, there's this recurring theme of actually whenever he uses the word see, it's not just physical eyesight. It's actually a new kind of understanding. It's being awakened to a truth of who Jesus really is. And to see Jesus, therefore, is to be changed. So they're going to see him all right. They will see him. And when they see him, everything they know about themselves, the world around him, their friendships, and everything they know about God is going to change. So the angel says, you will see him. They're going to see him all right. And then he says, just as he told you. Now, what did he tell them? So we need to go back a bit. What did Jesus tell them? Because you can imagine in this moment when the angel says, just as he told you, they're immediately going back, hold on, what did he tell us? Well, bare bones details tells us, 1, Jesus told them that he would be betrayed, arrested, deserted, denied by friends, that he would go to trial, and there'd be crucifixion. All of that has come true. He also predicted that he would rise from the dead. Again, you can imagine, all of a sudden they're sort of shaking. There's some consternation. The things that seemed very puzzling, now they're putting the pieces together. Just as he told you, what else did he say? He also told them that his disciples, Mark 14 actually to be exact, his disciples would see him in Galilee. And now the angel is saying, remember all these things? Just as he told you? This is what Jesus meant. So when the angel says these words to the women, you've got to believe that there's emotional weight. There is emotional weight to these words. Their mind goes back to what Jesus said, all the words, and now they're putting it all together. The question is, how will they respond? They respond with fear, actually. There's trembling, there's astonishment. There's that mixture of, yes, there's fear, but also a common response to whenever someone encounters Jesus in the Gospels, it's astonishment, there's amazement, there's wonder. So there is that, but it's also mixed with some fear. And they say, what we have here in this account, they say nothing to anyone out of fear. Now, just a really quick sidebar here. And I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but an important sidebar. If you are reading along in a Bible right now, you'll see, regardless of your translation, there's a note there that the earliest manuscripts tell us that this is the end of Mark as we know it. It's unfinished. Some scholars would say it's unfinished or it was lost. But whatever it is, this is what most scholars would say. This is what we have as earliest manuscript. So in one sense, whether it was finished or lost, or Mark it was incomplete, that's what we have. Now, is that how it ended? Well, we know from the other accounts that no, actually, they had fear, they experienced fear, they didn't say anything, but that wasn't the end, because we know from the other accounts, they actually did go on to tell people. We know from the other biographical stories of Jesus, they actually did go to tell other people. The news got out that Jesus was alive. So their fear, their silence was limited. So they're frozen in fear, but we also know that that is not the end game. But I do want to zoom in on these first 8 verses and come back to the big question here. What does this story, the resurrection story of Jesus, how does it answer, how does it help us discover truth, God, how he sees us, and how we are to respond to him? So let's work through that detail here. Let's start with truth. How does this story help us discover something of truth? Well, let me work through a very practical conversation that some of us may have had, or we might be having this Easter, or we will have in the future around the resurrection of Jesus. Because at a cultural level, at a popular cultural level, this story for most people, even if you're a person of no faith, or you might have another other faith that you adhere to, this story is actually compelling. It has very high compelling power. So you don't have to be religious or a person of faith to say, wow, that's a beautiful story. But usually for many people in our world right now, it stops there. It's, wow, what a beautiful story that God came down and did that. Wow, beautiful. But it stops there. Because if you sort of do a bit of digging, then if you have friends like mine, they will say, it's just sad that it's not true. Because that would be amazing. It would be even more amazing if it were true. But we all know, like, dead people don't. They don't come back to life. Surely you know that. I mean, that's where the conversation usually stops. So it's actually worth digging into. How do we know this thing to be true? How do we know the resurrection story to be true? That's a million-dollar question. So let's sort of run through this, just bare bones details. How do we know this to be true? Well, let's look at it through the eyes of a historian. When historians of, say, antiquity or antique literature, particularly this text, would look at this to say, how do we know this is trustworthy? How do we know this is true? Well, there's one thing that becomes important, and it's actually the mentioning of names. I don't want to get too technical here, but a guy by the name of Richard Bauckham did a work. He's a leading New Testament scholar years ago, and he talked about in this book, almost one of the major things that he showed in this book was actually why names are mentioned in the scriptures, and particularly in the New Testament. And he said, look, as historians, and he was going down the academic road, he said, look, if we are interested in history, we've got to look at why does Mark in this passage mention names? Because that's a clue to history. And in this case, we would look at the name, who the people mentioned. One, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James and Shalom. Those are the two names. What he says is, the scholar says, look, there's a reason why he mentioned these names. He's writing to a particular readership. The original listeners, he's assuming that they would know these people. So he's writing, as he would call it, a living memory report. He's effectively saying, look, to the first listeners, he's saying, look, if you don't believe me that this happened, go talk to Mary Magdalene. Go talk to Mary, mother of James and Shalom. They can tell you what I saw. He's saying, look, you can call me out on this. If you don't believe me, go to these people. It's a living memory report. But that's just one piece of data. The other part is actually the fact that women are mentioned in the story as the eyewitnesses, as the people they are charged with actually getting the news out. Now, why is that important? Well, again, coming back and working all the counter perspectives of people saying, well, this story actually is amazing, but it was made up. They were trying to start something. Well, again, historians will say, if that's the case, why would they mention women? Because in first century Palestine, women, they were not seen as credible witnesses. There was a very low view of women in first century Palestine. So if Mark is making the story up, he's just sort of fabricating the story, he's going to omit the part about women seeing an angel and them being charged with telling people about Jesus. They're going to put in someone of high stature or high standing in the culture, not women. But historians look at this and say, hold on, if they mention women, they're the eyewitnesses? Man, that's embarrassing. And historians say, that's so embarrassing, it must be true. This is how historians look at it. So that's one part of the names of the women. And then almost like the huge one is the empty tomb. How do we know Jesus rose from the dead? Well, the empty tomb is a dead giveaway. Pardon the pun. You don't see a body in there anymore. He was there. He's not there anymore. Now, let's work the counter perspective. Because many of my friends will say, yeah, but so what? These guys wanted it to be true, so they just stole the body. And many people actually, this is an argument that's really coming up for arrogant. When people think about Jesus, they say, well, yeah, it happened, but they stole the body, so that's why. They wanted it to be true. So we never have found the body. And that actually is very possible until you get to the point that he appeared to people. That's a problem. All of a sudden you have the empty tomb. It's like, well, hold on a second. He appeared to people. Now, working the counter perspective, because people really they don't like this, and that's part of the thing about Jesus' resurrection. It's not necessarily that the evidence is suppressed. It's actually that some people just don't want the thing to be true. It's very odd, but sometimes that is the case. People actually work the argument that actually there's hallucination. That, okay, well, Jesus didn't really appear to people. There was this mass hallucination because, again, they wanted the thing to be true. They wanted to see him, so there was this mass hallucination. That, in terms of modern psychology, is highly unlikely, but actually, let's even work that angle. Say there was a mass hallucination. That could work if Jesus just appeared to one group of people. But actually, we know from the scriptures that Jesus appeared to loads of people in different places, up close, from afar, on the shore of Galilee, in different rooms. He had meals with people. It wasn't just one group of people. So the idea of there being this mass hallucination, boy, you got to really work. You got to jump through hoops to get to that point. Eventually, you see that this is true. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is rooted in truth. The mentioning of names, the women as the eyewitnesses, the empty tomb, the appearances. Paul actually says Jesus appeared to over 500 people. It's got to at least make us stop to at least give it some time here to think. If the roadblock is this isn't true, that's got to make us think. And those are just actually a few strands of data. The resurrection of Jesus is rooted in truth. Now, have you ever wondered how strange this is? For some of us who we've been in the church for so long, it might help us to remember how strange this is. Because so much of Christianity actually still does translate to our culture, even though so much of Christianity has been lost or caricatured in our cultural moment. But if you say even though it's somewhat contentious, even if you say Merry Christmas, and it still works. People actually, that's not going to ruffle too many feathers. Okay, some places, yes, but if you say Happy Easter, no problem. But here's one that's going to give people a strange look. Imagine yourself going to Costco or Home Depot or going to your next soccer game and saying to your teammates, "He's risen." Well, hold on. He's risen. Because that actually, Happy Easter is still a bit like, that's safe. But if you say he's risen, it's actually pinpointing the fact that God raised his son from the dead. And that completely goes against everything we know. If there's nothing about this story that makes us at least stop and say, hold on, what happened there? Then maybe we're not paying enough attention to it. So we discover history through the story. But we also discover something of the power of God in the story. The sheer enormous power of God in the story is revealed. Jesus, who was crucified, God in the flesh, the image of the invisible God, Jesus Christ was crucified, he's dead, and now he has risen. They have no framework for this. We, in a big way, we don't have any framework for it either. Death is final. This is why Paul, again, calls death the final enemy. But the power of God is on full display here in raising Jesus from the dead. Now, there have been many people throughout history who have used story, allegory, metaphor to pinpoint something of the wonder, something of the profundity of this moment, of what actually happened. One of the best would have to be C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is known for many things, but his series, The Chronicles of Narnia. And in The Chronicles of Narnia, there's this one figure that is prominent. His name is Aslan. Aslan is this lion who is a Christological figure. He symbolized the work of Christ, the redemptive work of Christ. And in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan, there are problems. James, one of the boys in the story, he gets into a friendship with the witch, and the only way for things to be restored, the only way for peace to happen, the only way for restoration to happen is for Aslan to willingly give himself up to the witch, to be killed. And it's sad. You can feel, as you read, you can feel the pathos in the moment. His whole mane is shaved. Every sense of dignity, power, it's stripped from him. He's killed. And life as they know it has been finished. It's ended. It's done. But it's not the end. After these two girls, Susan and Lucy, are walking away from the spot where Aslan was killed, this is what happens. They hear a noise. They hear a voice. And it's Aslan. "Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. You're not a," asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real, you're real. Oh, Aslan," cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. But what does it all mean?" asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time, but if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backward." The witch knew a magic, but there was a deeper magic. You see, there is a deeper reality into which Jesus Christ invites us into today that is made possible through his resurrection. It's something of what we sang earlier today. "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" These are the words cited by Paul, the Apostle Paul, in one of his letters again. And I remember listening to a leading scholar named Gary Habermas on the resurrection. He's one of the leading scholars who's written on the resurrection of Christ. And I remember listening to him and saying, look, when Paul cites this in one of his letters saying, look, where death is your victory, where death is your sting, he's not doing poetry. He's not saying, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? No, Gary Habermas says it's because of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus that he's actually trash-talking death. Jesus makes it possible for Paul to trash talk death. Effectively, Paul is saying, death, do you think you've got something? Death, do you think you have sting? No. You've lost death. You have lost. You've been crushed. Jesus has crushed you. You have lost death. You're not the final story, death. You have lost. You've been defeated. Just think about that for a moment. Wow. Everything that death represents has been defeated. You think of the struggle, the toil, addiction, sin, the stuff that ensnares us, loss, pain, temptation. It all has an expiry date. Jesus has actually beaten the power of death over our lives and in the world, and he invites us into that world. He invites you, he invites me into that world. The sheer power of God is revealed in this story of the resurrection. Truth, the power of God. And then we also see something of how God sees us, how God sees you, how God sees me. In verse 7, the angel gives instructions. And almost it's a logical thing. He says, you need to go tell people about this. Go tell the disciples. And as I'm tracking along in that story, I'm thinking, yeah, absolutely. You got to go tell the disciples. You got to tell someone about this. That makes sense, but he doesn't stop there. Then he says, and Peter. Go tell the disciples and Peter. That's when, hold on a second. Peter? Not Peter. I think angel. Is that a typo? That's got to be a typo. Because, remember Brian talking to us a couple weeks ago about just you can't get much lower. I think the only guy who's got him beat is Judas. But Peter is, he swore at Christ. It was deliberate. It wasn't like he was doing it like daydreaming. He deliberately swore. He blasphemed Jesus. He did not want to have anything to do with him. So I'm thinking, surely not. Jesus doesn't want to see him. And if I'm Jesus, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I want to see Peter all right. I want to see that guy. I want to see that dirtbag. I'll tell him, oh yeah, Peter, you come here. Oh yeah, I've got something to say to you, Peter. What's Jesus going to do when he sees Peter? Is he going to shame him? He's going to guilt him? Is he going to say, you're done, Peter? No, it's not what Jesus does. Because what we know from the other accounts is actually when Jesus meets with Peter, it's not to guilt him, not to shame him, it's to restore him, to forgive him, to lavish his grace on Peter. What does that tell us? It tells us something so precious, so profound, so significant about the person, the nature, the character of the Christian God revealed to us in Jesus. It tells us that Jesus does not give up on us. Jesus does not give up on disciples, the one who failed him. Jesus doesn't give up on you. That's the story of the resurrection. Jesus Christ does not give up on you. Now, let's just stop there for a moment. How do we view God? Just think about that for a moment. How do we view God? And that's a big question. But the next question, bringing it back to this story, is how do you view God when you fail? The story of the resurrection of Jesus tells us something that goes against what we feel. Because I will say, when I fail, I feel like a very, very, very small child. I was like, I don't think I can go back to him yet. Because he already knows that I failed, and I failed him. I did something I should not have done. I'm too dirty. I'm too two-faced. And the story of resurrection of Jesus actually says, no. That baseline understanding of the resurrection, of the coming of Jesus, tells us that God's desire is simply to meet with us. Go see Jesus in Galilee. Go tell Peter. Jesus wants to see him. Simply to meet with him, to restore him. Jesus simply wants to meet with us. This story of Jesus wanting to see Peter tells us that no one is beyond his redemption. You are not beyond God's redemptive power. No one is beyond God's redemptive power. So how do we respond to this? We see truth. We see the nature, the power of God. We see how God sees us. How do we respond? Well, there are two things if we were to model something of what the women do here. They are instructed to go see Jesus. Now, I don't know where you are this morning. Maybe you are in a place like these women. Maybe there's fear. Maybe there's cynicism about life, about friendships, about the world in which we live. Maybe there's skepticism. Maybe there is amazement. But no matter where we are right now, the challenge is still the same. The encouragement is still the same. Go see Jesus. Go to the place where he told you he would be. What does that mean? For some of us, it might mean on this Easter to make a fresh commitment to Jesus Christ. That what Easter means this year for us might mean, okay, I'm committing it fresh to actually having Jesus Christ be the center of my life. I'm going to make room for him, make space, pay more attention to him, talk to him, listen to him, invite him into our life. That could be what Jesus Christ is challenging you with this morning, to simply make space, to pay more attention to him, to go see him. The irony of that is actually when we go to him, it's actually not our initiative, it's actually responding to his initiative. He's already come to see us. Will we go to see him? That's one challenge. The other challenge for many of us is to tell people about this. Now, what I find it interesting that when they are told to tell people about the disciples, the women don't say, "Oh, well, we can't tell anybody because we're not evangelists. But I don't have that gift. I think you had the wrong people. The person here, and in a way, it has nothing to do with evangelism. It has nothing to do with having a gift. We just think about it. If we're excited about something, if we are caught up in something, we tell people about that. And in a way, if we think tomorrow, for many of us going back to work, this is low-hanging fruit. Hey, what did you guys do over the weekend? That's a perfect opportunity to say, man, I was at Easter service. Oh, yeah, well, what's going on there? What did you do? That's a perfect opportunity to say, don't you know this is the most amazing thing that has changed the planet. It's changed my life. The challenge is for us to say, we're going to go see Jesus. We're going to make space for this. This is a reality that has changed the whole narrative of the world. I'm going to engage again with Jesus. That's a challenge for us. Will we do it? And will we tell people about him? About this new invitation, about this new world, about the risen Jesus? That's the challenge. Jesus Christ makes a new world possible. Life, death, resurrection, new world. There's redemption. No one is beyond his redemptive power. Go and see Jesus. Go and tell people about him. Let me pray. God, thank you that this is real. That is not just some theory, not just some academic ivory tower thinking that is just to inspire us and to create a different thought, but something of you coming to earth, changing the whole landscape, changing the game, changing our lives, changing the way we think about the world. Lord, in this moment now, I ask that you would change us afresh. Come by your Spirit and fill us. Help us to know you, God. In your name, amen.